Now, Kennedy's foreign policy is very much influenced by the Cold War. And the difference for this, which because the Cold War dominates pretty much every president's foreign policy from 1945 to 1991, is that Kennedy tried to engage in the Cold War in a slightly different way than earlier presidents. For example, Kennedy focusing very heavily on the winning the hearts and minds strategy of the Cold War created the Peace Corps, which recruited volunteers, particularly among young people like recent college graduates, to go to developing nations and help build schools and infrastructure and help improve local economies. And Kennedy believes that this gesture of goodwill, of support for these developing nations would help do a lot of good to recruit goodwill towards the United States. In 1966, already about 15,000 people had served in the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps still exists today, but now the Peace Corps has also pivoted away from just recruiting young people, say people who have recently graduated college or looking to take a break between high school and college, and they're also actively recruiting retirees for the Peace Corps. Kennedy also focused on the Cold War outside of Earth, particularly the space race. Now, the Soviets had made history by launching the first successful satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. And the following year, Eisenhower, who was still president at that time, had established NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, as a central agency to try to respond to the Soviet innovations in space exploration. However, NASA will get an increase in funding and public support from Kennedy when in 1961 the Soviets launched the first manned satellite. Kennedy then publicly promises in a very famous speech to put a man on a moon by the end of the decade. And to be able to accomplish that goal, which sounds completely ludicrous to people as he's giving the speech in 1961, he got Congress to up the funding for NASA to be able to try to compete against the Soviets, who definitely had the leg up in the space race. Down to Earth, Kennedy is also going to be responsible for escalating U.S. involvement in Vietnam. We've talked before about how during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, the United States had loaned a lot of money and equipment to the French in their attempt to quash an independence movement in Vietnam. And we also mentioned that in 1956, the leader of the temporarily divided southern portion of Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, had ignored the Geneva Accords, the peace treaty that was signed between France and Vietnam, and refused to hold elections to reunify Vietnam, which was an important term of the peace treaty. So the United States, because there's now guerrilla war in Vietnam between the people who support reunification and the leader of South Vietnam, who's anti-communist and rejects it because he knows Ho Chi Minh will win a unified election, start to ask the United States for help. So the United States adopts the policy of counterinsurgency for Vietnam. The idea was that they wanted to try to neutralize this rebellion in South Vietnam against Ngo Dinh Diem, and this will officially become the policy of the US by 1960, so in the very late stages of Eisenhower's administration, but Kennedy is going to be the one who really ramps this up. So, in order to advise South Vietnam on how to put down their insurgency, Kennedy will not only provide military aid in the form of equipment, but also we will send military advisors. So, US troops and officers who were sent to Vietnam to advise the South Vietnamese on tactics to quash this rebellion. By 1963, there are about 17,000 of these military advisors in the United States. However, even though the United States was sending increasing aid, they could not solve the problem of Ngo Dinh Diem's historic unpopularity. And in 1963, a military coup overthrew and killed him amid rising opposition to his rule. And this coup against Ngo Dinh Diem was actually supported by Americans who felt that if there was a leadership change in South Vietnam, this attempt to squash a pro-communist, pro-unified Vietnam rebellion would be more successful. Kennedy gets probably the most attention, at least in popular culture and popular consciousness of Kennedy's time in office, for his foreign policy with Cuba, not Vietnam. So Cuba had recently undergone a revolution in 1959, led by a young man named Fidel Castro. Cuba had been, prior to this revolution, led by a dictator, Fulgencio Batista, and Batista was very unpopular, not only because it was a dictatorship, there was very little democracy in Cuba, but also because he was very closely aligned with the United States government and with US businesses to the detriment of the Cuban people. So Batista was unpopular not only for denying civil liberties to the Cuban people, but also because he gave very much preferential treatment to Americans. So when Fidel Castro leads this revolution to oust Batista and install a new government, Castro tries to fix this economic dependence on the United States by nationalizing all American landholdings and investments, which upsets Americans because he's messing with American business interests. And then he further antagonizes Americans by starting open trade with the Soviet Union, leading Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was still president at the time of the Cuban Revolution, to declare a blockade on trade with Cuba. So when Kennedy comes into office, things with Cuba are tense. We've already stopped trading with them. We're already aware of Cuba's attempts to get a better working relationship with the Soviet Union. And this was particularly alarming for a couple of reasons. Number one, the policy of containment, right? We don't want Cuba getting cozy with the Soviet Union. We don't want them to go communist. Number two, Cuba is only about 90 miles away from the nearest US territory and the Florida Keys, so that's also a grave concern. And so the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, launches a plan to try to get rid of Castro and reverse the Cuban Revolution. In 1961, Cubans trained by the CIA launched an attempted invasion at the Bay of Pigs. 1,400 of these Cubans invaded, believing that they would be backed up by US military might as promised. Instead, the military support never comes, and the CIA drastically underestimated how popular Castro was because they assumed that with a relatively small invasion force that this would spark popular and open rebellion against Castro. Instead, this invasion ends in catastrophe, and the Bay of Pigs invasion will push Castro further towards the Soviet Union. This comes to a head in October 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the closest point that the Cold War ever comes to getting hot. So, in other words, this is the time where it is most likely that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union could have engaged in a direct military conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis begins in October of 1962 when American spy planes flying over Cuba reveal that the Soviets had sent and installed missiles to Cuba that were capable of striking the United States, not just Florida, who was 90 miles away from Cuba, but also major cities in the continental United States were within range of these missiles. Kennedy ordered a total blockade of Cuba, so not just suspend trade with Cuba, but prevent anybody from getting in and out of Cuba. And over the next 13 days, the world waited with held breath to see whether a nuclear war would in fact happen over this stand down. Kennedy negotiates with Khrushchev. Kennedy wants missiles withdrawn from Cuba. Khrushchev wants missiles withdrawn from Turkey because Americans had parked missiles in Turkey, which are similarly close to Soviet territory as the ones in Cuba were to American territory. And finally, after 13 days of negotiation, Khrushchev and Kennedy reach a deal, and the crisis is averted. Now, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, this changes Kennedy's approach to the Cold War. This causes Kennedy to dial down military rhetoric and to promote a friendlier relationship with the Soviet Union, including a 1963 treaty agreeing to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere or space. So Kennedy, after this point, seems to be moving more towards a friendlier, more peaceful, cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union. However, Kennedy's assassination in 1963 and the elevation of Lyndon Baines Johnson to the presidency, who does not have as much foreign policy experience, will unfortunately negatively impact the United States by worsening the issues with our involvement in Vietnam.